When a father weaponizes his daughter's credit score to force her obedience, he forgets one thing. He raised a woman who knows the law. I'll show you how Sarah turned his arrogance into a trap that finally broke his control forever. I'm Lucy May. I hope you're all staying warm today. How is the weather in your corner of the world? Please, leave a comment and let me know. I truly cherish our little chats here. Today's story is a heavy one, but it's a necessary reminder of why boundaries matter. Let's look through Sarah's eyes as she faces a storm much colder than the Chicago wind. I was 26 years old, a marketing specialist making $50,000 a year, and every cent of my modest life in Chicago was a testament to my own grit. Or so I thought, until my phone vibrated in my pocket with a persistence that felt like a physical shove. I pulled it out, the screen glowing against the dim hallway light, and there it was, a text from my father, Arthur. It wasn't a greeting, and it certainly wasn't an inquiry about whether I had survived the blizzard. It read, "The $40,000 for your tuition was not a gift, Sarah. It was a capital injection. Hand over a spare key to your mother today, or be prepared to settle your debt in full by Monday morning." The words sat there, cold and transactional, stripping away the illusion of my independence in a single paragraph. My heart did a slow, heavy roll in my chest, but I didn't cry. I couldn't afford to. I stood there for a long moment, the silence of the hallway pressing in on me, practicing what I call the silence of the abyss. I let the shock wash over me, and then I pushed it down, deep into the place where I kept all the other investments my father had made in my soul. I pressed my thumb to the scanner of my deadbolt, the mechanical whir usually a sound of safety, but as the door swung open, the smell of lavender and expensive floor wax hit me, a scent that didn't belong to me. It belonged to my mother, Margaret. I walked into the living room to find her standing in front of my open closet, her hands moving through my work blazers with a casual, terrifying entitlement. She didn't even flinch when she saw me. She just looked over her shoulder, a small, tight smile on her face that didn't reach her eyes, and said that she was just checking to see if I needed any organization. The betrayal was a physical weight, a suffocating realization that the four walls I paid for with my own sweat were being treated like an extension of my father's estate. My mother was a puppet, a well-dressed extension of Arthur's will, sent here to mark his territory because I had dared to suggest that I didn't need his permission to live my own life. I watched her, my face a mask of practiced neutrality, noting how she tucked a small, silver object into her palm when she thought I wasn't looking. It was my spare key, the one I kept in the kitchen drawer for emergencies. The arrogance of it was breathtaking. My father truly believed that because he had signed a few checks for my education, he owned the right to breathe my air and audit my privacy. He was weaponizing his generosity, turning a college degree into a leash. I didn't scream, and I didn't demand she leave. Instead, I walked over to the kitchen counter, set my bag down with a soft thud, and poured myself a glass of water, my hand steady despite the roar in my ears. I let the silence stretch until it became uncomfortable for her, until she started fidgeting with the hem of her cashmere coat. I was observing the monster in the room, realizing that the man who taught me about the American dream and the value of hard work was the same man who would bankrupt his own daughter's peace of mind to maintain control. I finally looked at her, my voice dropping into a tone so cold it could have matched the Chicago wind outside. I didn't ask why she was there. I didn't ask how she got in. I simply held out my hand, palm up, and waited. She sighed, that performative, "you're being so difficult" sigh she had mastered over 30 years of marriage to a tyrant, and dropped the key into my hand. "Your father only wants what's best for you, Sarah," she whispered, her voice laced with a pity that made my skin crawl. "He's worried you're losing your way. $50,000 a year is a hobby, not a career, and he needs to know his investment is being protected." I looked at the key in my palm, the cold metal biting into my skin. She thought she was giving it back. She thought this was the end of the confrontation, a minor skirmish in a war they had already won. I tucked the key into my pocket, nodding slowly, playing the role of the daughter who had been properly chastened. But as she walked toward the door, throwing one last look at my modest life, I realized that I wasn't just losing my sanctuary, I was being hunted in it. I didn't know then that the key she returned was just a distraction, a piece of brass meant to keep me complacent while the real locks were being picked behind my back. I stood in the center of my violated home, the silence no longer a refuge but a countdown. I didn't feel like a victim anymore. I felt like a strategist. If my father wanted to treat my life like a business transaction, then it was time he learned that every investment carries a risk, and I was about to become his most expensive mistake. The silence my mother left behind wasn't a peace. It was a vacuum, a hollow space where my sense of safety used to live. I stood in the middle of my living room, the silver key heavy in my pocket, watching the dust motes dance in the late afternoon Chicago sun. Then, the vibration started again, a rhythmic, aggressive buzzing on the granite countertop that felt like a predator scratching at the door. I didn't need to look at the caller ID to know it was Arthur. My father didn't call to chat. He called to audit. I picked up the phone, but I didn't say hello. I waited, practicing that silence of the abyss, letting the line crackle with the weight of things unsaid. He didn't disappoint. His voice came through the speaker, booming and crisp, the sound of a man who was used to being the loudest person in every boardroom. He didn't ask if I was warm enough in the -2-degree weather or if I had eaten dinner. He went straight for the ledger. "I assume your mother has the key, Sarah?" he barked, his tone abrupt and patronizing, as if he were talking to a junior associate who had fumbled a basic filing task. I let the silence stretch for 5 seconds, then 10. I could almost hear his blood pressure rising through the fiber optic cables. "She has a key, Father," I said finally, my voice a flat, dead calm. I didn't tell him it was the one I'd just snatched back. He let out a sharp, dismissive huff. "Good. Because let's be clear about the reality of your situation. You seem to have developed this delusion that you are an independent woman because you have a cubicle and a title." He paused, and I knew the insult was coming, polished and sharp. $50,000 a year, Sarah. 50,000. Do you have any idea how pathetic that sounds in a city like Chicago? That isn't a salary. It's a rounding error on my tax returns. I closed my eyes, picturing him in his leather chair, probably swirling a glass of scotch, looking out over a world he thought he bought and paid for. This was the American dream he had preached to me, the idea that hard work leads to success, but for him, it only applied if he held the leash. He saw my life as a failed startup, and he was the venture capitalist coming in to liquidate the assets. That $40,000 I spent on your degree was an investment in a product that I expected to yield a certain level of obedience and prestige, he continued, his voice dripping with a cold, calculated arrogance. Instead, I have a daughter who thinks she can lock her doors against the very hands that fed her. You are one bad month, one layoff, or one medical bill away from being another face in the gutter. He said it with such certainty, such relish, that I realized he wasn't afraid of me failing. He was praying for it. He wanted me broken, so he could be the one to put the pieces back together in his own image. I stayed silent, my internal monologue a sarcastic sneer that he would never hear. I was observing the monster now, stripped of the father mask, showing the teeth of a man who valued control over connection. He didn't see a daughter. He saw a line item that was underperforming. You have 24 hours to come to your senses and send me the login credentials for your savings account, he demanded, the ultimatum hanging in the air like a guillotine blade. I will manage your wealth, since you clearly lack the capacity to do more than survive on scraps. If you refuse, don't bother calling when your landlord realizes you can't actually afford to live in that zip code without my shadow behind you. I felt a strange, chilling sense of clarity. The man who claimed to protect my financial security was the very person threatening to dismantle it. He thought he was the architect of my life, but he was really just the wrecking ball. I hear you, Father, I said, the words tasting like copper in my mouth. I didn't agree. I didn't argue. I just gave him the acknowledgement he craved so I could get him off the line. You'll do more than hear me, Sarah, he spat, his final volley of arrogance intended to leave a mark. You'll be kneeling on the sidewalk, begging for a room in my house when your landlord tosses your cheap furniture into the snow. Remember that $40,000 every time you turn your bolt at night. It's not your door, it's mine. The line went dead with a long, mechanical beep that echoed in the silence of my apartment. I pulled the phone away from my ear, my hand trembling just slightly, not from fear, but from the sheer electricity of my own rising anger. He had just laid out the terms of his war. He truly believed I was a failure because I didn't have his millions. But he had forgotten one thing. He was the one who taught me how to be a strategist. He was the one who taught me that an investment is only as good as the contract that protects it. As I looked at the dark screen of my phone, I didn't feel like a victim. I felt like a woman who was about to show her father the true cost of a bad investment. The dial tone echoed in the quiet of my apartment, a mechanical heartbeat that felt like a mockery of the pulse drumming in my ears. I set the phone down on the granite counter, my gaze falling on my own hands. They were trembling, just a fraction, but enough to make me notice the faint, silver scars on my knuckles. Souvenirs from 3 years of working 24-hour shifts at a greasy diner while I was supposedly enjoying the education my father now claimed as his private property. It was funny how Arthur remembered the $40,000, but had conveniently deleted the image of his only daughter coming home at 2 a.m, smelling of old fry oil and desperation. I stood there in the chilling Chicago twilight, the memories of those years flooding back not as a warm nostalgia, but as a series of cold, hard cracks in the foundation of our family. This was the life investment my father bragged about. But I was the only one who had ever paid the interest in sweat and missed sleep. I remembered one specific Thanksgiving, 3 years ago, when the disparity between his children became a permanent stain on my heart. I had just finished a double shift to cover my electricity bill, my skin gray with exhaustion, and my hands cracked and bleeding from the industrial soap we used at the cafe. I walked into my parents' mahogany-filled dining room to find my brother Brandon holding court. He was 32 then, leaning back in a chair that probably cost more than my car, bragging about his new venture, a boutique gym that had folded in 6 months, marking his second bankruptcy in 5 years. My father hadn't looked at Brandon with the cold, clinical eyes of a creditor. No, he had smiled, reached into his pocket, and slid a set of keys across the table. Keys to a brand new silver SUV. "Everyone deserves a fresh start, son," Arthur had said, his voice warm with a paternal pride I had never tasted. When I asked for a small loan to fix the heater in my studio apartment that same night, he had looked at me as if I were a beggar on the street and told me that struggle builds character in a woman. The injustice of it was a bitter pill that I had swallowed for years, believing that if I just worked harder, if I reached that $50,000 milestone on my own, I would finally earn the right to his respect. I believed in the American dream he preached, the one where hard work leads to success and independence. But looking at the silver key my mother had just dropped into my hand, I realized the game was rigged from the start. Arthur didn't want a successful daughter. He wanted a subordinate one. Brandon was allowed to fail, to squander thousands on whim after whim, because his failures kept him dependent and therefore loyal. I was the threat, because I had actually succeeded in carving out a life he couldn't claim as his own. My father's definition of protection was nothing more than a cage built of old tuition receipts and the crushing weight of a debt I never asked him to incur. I walked over to the window, looking out at the city lights. I thought about the thousands of women like me and the women of my mother's generation who had spent their lives or their children's lives being told that their contributions were hobbies and their independence was a delusion. My mother, Margaret, was the ultimate cautionary tale. A woman who had traded her autonomy for a cashmere coat and a seat at Arthur's table, now reduced to a common thief in her own daughter's home. She had been trained to see my self-reliance as a personal insult to her husband's ego. "Con girls don't need independence, Sarah." My father's voice rang in my head, a ghostly echo from a dozen different dinners where he had reminded me that my only value was in my obedience. He truly believed that by providing that $40,000, he had purchased a permanent seat at the table of my life, with the power to veto my choices and audit my very thoughts. But as I stood in the darkening room, the anger began to crystallize into something much more dangerous than resentment. It became a plan. If Arthur wanted to treat our relationship like a hostile takeover, then he had forgotten that I was the one who had spent the last 4 years studying market volatility and consumer behavior. I wasn't just a rounding error on his tax returns. I was a liability he had failed to properly assess. I looked down at my cracked knuckles, the old scars a reminder that I knew how to survive things that would break a man like Brandon in a week. I realized then that my father's greatest mistake wasn't his arrogance or his cruelty. It was his assumption that I was still the same girl who would cry for his approval. He thought he was the only one who knew how to manage an investment. But I was about to show him that some debts are paid in ways he never saw coming. I turned the silver key over in my hand, the metal still cold from my mother's palm. At first glance, it looked identical to the one I had given her months ago for emergencies. But as the kitchen light caught the ridges, something felt wrong. The brass was too bright, the edges too sharp, lacking the dull patina of a key that had actually lived in a purse for half a year. I pulled my own keychain from my bag and laid the two side by side on the counter. My heart performed a slow, sickening slide into my stomach. The ridges didn't match perfectly. This was a fresh cut, a hardware store copy made within the last 48 hours. My mother hadn't just returned my key. She had returned a decoy, a cheap imitation of the truth, while the original, the one that actually turned the lock to my life, was still out there in the world, tucked into a designer handbag or resting on my father's mahogany desk. It was a masterclass in gaslighting. Arthur didn't just want access to my apartment. He wanted the satisfaction of knowing I felt safe while he held the ultimate power of entry. A cold shiver, far more biting than the -2-degree Chicago wind, raced down my spine as I began to walk through my home with new, clinical eyes. I had noticed small things over the last 2 weeks. A chair angled slightly differently, the scent of lavender lingering when I hadn't used my diffuser, a stack of mail that seemed to have been ruffled through, but I had dismissed them as the side effects of a $50,000 a year workload and chronic exhaustion. I was wrong. I walked into my bedroom, my breath hitching as I looked at the pristine white duvet. There, resting on the fabric like a silver thread of betrayal, was a single strand of long, blonde hair. It wasn't mine. My hair is a dark chestnut brown. This belonged to Margaret. She hadn't just been organizing my closet today. She had been here, sitting on my bed, perhaps even lying there, while I was at the office trying to earn the independence they were so desperate to steal. The violation felt physical, a thick, oily film covering everything I owned. My home was no longer a sanctuary. It was a stage where my parents performed their quiet acts of surveillance while I was away. I sat on the edge of the bed, careful not to touch the spot where she had been, and felt the walls closing in. The arrogance of it was what stung the most. The absolute certainty Arthur had that I was too stupid or too distracted to notice. He treated my privacy like a surplus commodity he could trade for his own peace of mind. To him, that $40,000 in tuition wasn't just a loan. It was a permanent warrant for search and seizure. I looked at the fake key on the nightstand, its shiny surface mocking me. They wanted me to think I had won a small victory today, to think that by taking back that piece of metal, I had reclaimed my boundaries. It was a trap designed to keep me complacent. I realized then that I was living in a glass box, and my father was the one holding the magnifying glass, waiting for me to catch fire under the heat of his scrutiny. The realization was terrifying, but it was also a gift. The silent generation and the baby boomers who raised me always spoke of the sanctity of the home, of the castle every woman was entitled to. But my father had rewritten those rules. The fear didn't last long. It was quickly consumed by a cold, searing logic that felt like ice water in my veins. I realized I couldn't just change the locks. If I did, Arthur would know I had caught on, and he would escalate his tactics before I was ready. He would use the debt, the investment, to crush me before I could even find a new place to live. No. If he wanted to play the role of the invisible observer, then I would give him exactly what he wanted to see. I would play the part of the struggling, overwhelmed daughter, the one who lived on $50,000 a year and didn't notice a single hair out of place. I would be the invisible observer in my own life. While they watched me, I would be watching them back, but with a clarity they couldn't possibly imagine. I stood up, walked back to the kitchen, and placed the fake key exactly where my mother had found the real one. The game had changed. I wasn't just a daughter anymore. I was a counterintelligence agent in a one-bedroom apartment. I didn't need to run. I needed to build a dossier. I took a deep breath, the Chicago winter air leaking through the window frames, and felt the shift in my own spirit. The silence of the abyss wasn't just a defense mechanism anymore. It was my primary weapon. Arthur and Margaret thought they held the only key to my future, but they had forgotten that I was the one who designed the lock. If they wanted to weaponize my education against me, they were about to find out exactly how much I had learned about leverage and liability. I looked around the room one last time, no longer seeing a violated space, but a crime scene that I was about to document with professional precision. I wasn't going to kneel on the sidewalk and beg for my freedom. I was going to earn it by being the most patient, most observant, and most dangerous investment my father had ever made. The war had officially moved into the shadows, and for the first time in my life, I felt like the one with the home court advantage. The morning after the discovery of the fake key, Chicago felt different. The -2-degree wind still rattled the window panes of my office in the Loop, but I didn't feel the chill anymore. I felt the heat of a high-stakes campaign. As a marketing specialist, I was trained to analyze threats, manage brand reputation, and leverage data to change a narrative. If my father, Arthur, wanted to treat my life as a capital investment, then he was about to learn that every investment is subject to a strict audit. I sat at my desk, my fingers dancing across the keyboard. To any colleague walking by, it looked like I was drafting a social media strategy for a new client. In reality, I was conducting the most important market research of my life. I wasn't just a daughter anymore. I was a strategist building a case for my own sovereignty. I wasn't doing this out of a petty desire for revenge. I was doing it for justice, reclaiming the air I paid for with my own $50,000 a year sweat. The first step was the ASMR for the brain, the technical, clinical preparation that turned my fear into a series of actionable tasks. I bypassed the standard security systems that Arthur could easily hack or override and went for something more discreet. I ordered 3 high-definition, motion-activated cameras disguised as ordinary household objects, a USB wall charger for the kitchen, a small digital clock for the bedroom, and a bookshelf speaker for the living room. When they arrived, I didn't just plug them in. I spent hours calibrating the wide-angle lenses to ensure every inch of my violated sanctuary was under my own surveillance. I felt a cold, intellectual satisfaction as I synced the encrypted cloud feed to a burner phone I had purchased in cash. This was my invisible observer phase. I wanted to catch the exact moment the pride in Margaret's eyes turned into the mechanical execution of Arthur's orders. I was no longer a victim waiting for a door to open. I was the one holding the remote, watching the predator walk into a trap of their own making. Between my marketing meetings, I began a deep dive into the Illinois compiled statutes. I didn't need a lawyer yet. I needed the diction of expertise to know exactly where the line was drawn in the dirt. That's when I found it, the Safe Homes Act. It was a powerful piece of legislation designed to protect tenants from those who sought to weaponize their living situation against them. I read every subsection, every clause about unauthorized entry, and the right to terminate a lease without penalty if one's safety was compromised. I learned that even in the face of a father who claimed his $40,000 investment gave him the right to my keys, the law recognized my home as my castle. I began to compile a digital dossier, a folder on a hidden drive titled Market Volatility. Inside were time-stamped screenshots of every threatening text Arthur had sent, every mention of the debt he claimed I owed, and every demand for my financial credentials. These weren't just messages anymore. They were the receipts of a campaign of harassment. The final piece of my awakening was the organization of the physical evidence. I spent my evening in the silence of the abyss, printing out the documents in my office after hours, the rhythmic hum of the laser printer providing a soothing soundtrack to my transformation. I organized the pages into a professional black leather binder. On the first page was the proof of my mother's unauthorized entry, recorded in crystal clear 1080p resolution. On the second was the side-by-side photo of the real and fake keys. I felt a strange, chilling sense of calm as I snapped the rings of the binder shut. Arthur thought my $50,000 salary made me a rounding error, but he had failed to account for the fact that I had zero overhead and 100% commitment to my own freedom. I wasn't crying over the betrayal anymore. I was editing the final draft of his downfall. As I looked at the binder, I realized that these weren't just papers. They were the weapons that would turn his arrogance into a liability he could never afford to settle. The trap was set. The cameras were live, and for the first time in 26 years, I was the one in control of the narrative. I sat in my small kitchen, the steam from my coffee rising like a white flag against the backdrop of another gray Chicago morning. The -2-degree wind rattled the window panes, a constant reminder of the harsh world outside. But the storm brewing inside my phone was far more treacherous. To defeat a man like Arthur, I couldn't just fight. I had to perform. I had to become the very thing he expected, a broken, overwhelmed girl who finally realized she couldn't survive without his superior wisdom. I picked up my phone, my fingers steady as I typed a message that felt like swallowing ash. Father, I've been sitting here thinking about everything you said. I haven't slept. You're right. The city is too much, and I'm barely keeping my head above water. I'm sorry for being so stubborn about the key and the money. I just want things to go back to how they were. I need your help. I hit send and watched the little bubbles dance. It was a masterpiece of manufactured vulnerability, the perfect bait for a man whose ego was his greatest blind spot. The response was almost instantaneous, a digital roar of triumph that arrived with the weight of a heavy gavel. Arthur didn't just accept the apology. He moved in for the kill, his words dripping with that familiar, patronizing tone that made my skin crawl. "It's about time you woke up, Sarah. Recognition of your own failure is the first step toward true management. Since you finally admit you can't handle your $50,000 life, we will begin the restructuring immediately. Send me the login credentials for your primary savings and checking accounts by 5 tonight. I will oversee your distributions to ensure that $40,000 investment isn't squandered on your poor choices." I stared at the screen, my internal monologue a sharp, sarcastic sneer that would have withered him if he could hear it. I could almost see him in his study, adjusting his silk tie, feeling the rush of absolute control as he prepared to dismantle my financial autonomy under the guise of protection. He truly believed that my silence was submission, that he had finally broken the spirit of the daughter who dared to think she was worth more than a rounding error. I didn't argue. I didn't push back. Instead, I spent the afternoon playing the role of the invisible observer, moving through my apartment with a calculated, sluggish grace that suggested a woman defeated. I knew the cameras were rolling, not just the ones I had hidden, but the ones Arthur kept in his mind. I went to the kitchen drawer and moved the fake silver key to a more prominent position, making sure that if Margaret decided to use her original one to sneak back in, she would see that I was complying. Every movement was part of a larger choreography designed to lure them into a state of total overconfidence. I was acting as the good, obedient daughter, the one who didn't notice the hair on the pillow or the shifted chair, because it was essential they believed I had lost my edge. This was the ASMR for the brain for the woman I was becoming, a strategist who understood that the most effective way to win a war was to let the enemy think they had already won. As the clock ticked toward 5, I sat at my desk and prepared the final piece of the lure. I didn't send him my real passwords, of course. I sent him the credentials to a secondary account I had opened weeks ago, one with exactly $112 in it, just enough to look like a struggling 26-year-old's failure, but not enough to give him any real leverage over my future. I watched the confirmation email land in my inbox and felt a cold, intellectual satisfaction spread through my chest. "Here you go, Father. Thank you for taking this off my plate," I texted back, my voice in my head dripping with irony that tasted like victory. I wasn't doing this because I hated him, though the fire of resentment was still there. I was doing it because I had a right to exist without being a line item in someone else's ledger. I was reclaiming my life, one deceptive click at a time. I looked over at the USB wall charger plugged into the outlet near the counter, my silent witness, recording every detail of my fabricated surrender. I caught my reflection in the dark screen of my laptop and saw a stranger looking back. It wasn't the scared girl who had been shaken by a text message 48 hours ago. It was a woman who had mastered the art of the slow reveal. A woman who understood that my father's arrogance was the very rope I would use to tie his hands. I let out a soft, bitter laugh that the microphone wouldn't catch. Arthur was so busy counting his imaginary winnings that he hadn't noticed the board had been flipped. I was no longer playing his game. I was building my own, and the opening moves were perfect. The notification on my work computer chirped at exactly 2:10 in the afternoon, a digital signal that Arthur had officially bitten the hook. He had logged into the bait account, the one with exactly $112.43, sitting in it like a lonely island in a sea of his disappointment. I could almost hear the vein in his forehead pulsing all the way from his suburban estate. A few minutes later, my phone lit up with a series of texts that were less like messages and more like a forensic audit of a failed state. $112, Sarah? Is this some kind of sick joke? He typed, his words practically vibrating with a patronizing fury. This is exactly why your mother and I have to step in. You are playing house with a budget that wouldn't cover the dry cleaning for my suits. I have already drafted a restrictive budget for you. From now on, your paycheck will be deposited directly into the joint management account I've set up. I will allot you a weekly stipend for groceries and transit. No more marketing your way out of reality. I sat at my desk, my face a mask of corporate neutrality, while my internal monologue was a sharp, biting sneer. I typed back a shaky, "Thank you, Father. I didn't realize how bad it was. I'll tell HR to update my direct deposit tomorrow." I was a marketing specialist, after all. I knew how to sell a lie to someone who was already desperate to believe they were the smartest person in the room. The ASMR for the brain continued that night, but with a much higher stakes rhythm. I returned to my apartment, purposely leaving the fake silver key on the counter where it was clearly visible, acting the part of the daughter who had finally surrendered her autonomy. I moved with a calculated, weary grace, knowing the hidden cameras were rolling, and hoping that my mother's original key was still in her possession. At 11 past 11, while the Chicago wind howled against the brickwork like a wounded animal, my phone buzzed with a motion alert from the living room camera. I was in my bedroom, the door cracked just an inch, watching the live feed on my burner phone with a heart that beat with the cold precision of a clock. The front door opened silently. Margaret stepped in, her cashmere coat shimmering under the hallway light. She didn't turn on the lamps. She used a small pen light, her movements practiced and invasive. She walked straight to my desk, her fingers sifting through my mail, her silhouette a haunting reminder of the protection I was being forced to endure. She was looking for bank statements, for evidence of my secret independence, while my father likely waited in the car or on the other end of an encrypted line, directing her like a puppet master. I watched her for 20 minutes, recording every second in high-definition 1080p resolution. I watched her touch my things, reorganize my folders, and finally, linger by the kitchen counter to inspect the fake key I'd left as a peace offering. She didn't know that every step she took was another paragraph in the legal tomb I was building. I felt a chilling sense of intellectual satisfaction as I realized that the man who had spent $40,000 on my education had forgotten that he'd taught me how to analyze liabilities. This wasn't just a family dispute anymore. This was a documented case of stalking and financial domestic abuse. I stayed in the silence of the abyss, my breathing shallow, until I heard the soft click of the deadbolt sliding back into place as she left. Only then did I open the black leather binder hidden beneath the false bottom of my dresser. I spent the next 4 hours at my kitchen table, the blue light of my laptop the only thing cutting through the Chicago dark. I wasn't just a marketing specialist now. I was a legal strategist. I had the Safe Homes Act pulled up on one side of the screen and my digital dossier on the other. I began filling out the paperwork for a temporary restraining order at the Cook County Courthouse, my fingers flying across the keys with a cold, searing purpose. I attached the time-stamped screenshots of Arthur's threats, the video of my mother's midnight raid, and the bank records proving that my father was attempting to seize my entire $50,000 income. This was the secret weapon that would turn his arrogance into a catastrophic failure. I wasn't doing this because I hated them. I was doing it because my life investment was finally paying off in the form of my own freedom. The tension in the room was so thick it felt like the -2-degree air had frozen the very oxygen. I knew that the showdown was coming. Arthur wasn't the type to wait for a stipend to be processed. He would want a physical display of my submission, a moment where he could look me in the eye and see the rounding error he'd finally corrected. I looked at the finalized documents, the PDF icons sitting on my desktop like loaded chambers in a revolver. I had played the invisible observer long enough. It was time to stop being the product and start being the one who closed the deal. I closed my laptop with a soft, final click, the sound echoing in the violated silence of my home. The trap was not only set, it was being baited with the very thing Arthur valued most: his own sense of absolute, unshakable power. Tomorrow, he would come to collect his dividends, and I would be there to serve him a notice of total liquidation. It's heartbreaking to see a father use a daughter's hard work against her, isn't it? Have you ever witnessed someone using financial help as a way to control their loved ones? I'd love to hear your thoughts in the comments. And if you're rooting for Sarah, please give this video a thumbs up to show your support. Now, let's see how Sarah uses her secret weapon. The sun rose over the Chicago skyline like a bruised plum, casting long, cold shadows across the icy pavement of Michigan Avenue. I hadn't slept. The adrenaline of a 1,000-word legal document and a high-definition recording of my mother's betrayal had acted as a better stimulant than any double espresso. I was 26 years old, and for the first time in my life, I felt older than the man who claimed to have invested $40,000 into my soul. I sat in my cubicle at the marketing firm, my eyes fixed on the secondary phone propped up against my monitor. It showed the live feed of my apartment building's lobby. I knew Arthur wouldn't be able to resist a physical confrontation once he realized the $112 bait was all he was going to get. He didn't just want my money. He wanted the spectacle of my submission. Around 10 in the morning, a black town car pulled up to the curb, and my father stepped out, his charcoal cashmere coat looking like armor against the -2-degree wind. He didn't look like a father coming to visit his daughter. He looked like a debt collector arriving to seize a failing business. The drama unfolded on my small screen with the clinical precision of a silent film. Arthur didn't just walk into the lobby. He stormed it, his presence demanding the immediate attention of the young man behind the concierge desk. Even without audio, I could see the arrogance in the way he stood, chest out, one hand resting on an expensive leather briefcase that probably cost more than my monthly rent. He began to shout, his face turning a mottled purple that matched the Chicago sunrise. I tapped the audio icon on my burner phone, and his voice filled my earbuds, sharp and patronizing. "I am Arthur Miller," he barked at the receptionist, who looked no older than 22. "My daughter, Sarah Miller, is in Unit 804. She is currently in breach of a significant financial agreement and is exhibiting signs of a mental breakdown. As her primary benefactor and the one who funded her $40,000 education, I demand immediate access to her unit to secure her assets before she does something further to ruin her credit rating. The receptionist, a boy named Leo who I usually swapped small talk with about the bears, looked terrified. "Sir, I can't let you up without the tenant's permission. It's building policy." My father let out a laugh that was more of a snarl, a sound dripping with the superiority of a man who believed policies were only for people who made $50,000 a year. "Policy? I am her father. I have the keys to that apartment in my pocket. Keys I was forced to duplicate because she's become unstable. Do you have any idea who I am? I could have your job by lunch and this entire building flagged for mismanagement by the end of the week." He was performing his favorite role, the high-powered executive crushing a subordinate. He wanted to humiliate me, to make sure the people who saw me every day viewed me as a delinquent debtor, a failure who couldn't survive without the heavy hand of her father. He was trying to poison the very ground I stood on, to ensure that if I ever tried to move or rent elsewhere, my reputation would be a scorched earth ruin. I watched him through the screen, practicing the silence of the abyss. I didn't call the lobby. I didn't rush home to plead with him. I stayed in my office, a marketing specialist documenting a brand's total collapse. In this case, the brand was Arthur the Devoted Father. The silence was my most powerful weapon. By not engaging, I was letting him destroy himself in high definition. He began to pace the lobby, his voice rising until a few other tenants stopped to stare. "She's a rounding error!" he screamed at no one in particular, his ego finally stripping away the last of his civility. "I built her. I paid for her. She wouldn't even have a roof over her head in this city if it wasn't for my charity." The irony was delicious. The man who claimed to be my protector was the one screaming to the world that I was a beggar. Finally, the lobby's head of security, a retired cop named Marcus who didn't care about Arthur's cashmere coat, stepped into the frame. He didn't look impressed by the $40,000 tuition or the leather briefcase. He put a hand on Arthur's shoulder, a gesture that made my father recoil as if he'd been touched by something diseased. I watched as Marcus spoke calmly, his words a sharp contrast to my father's hysterics. When Arthur tried to shove past him toward the elevators, Marcus didn't hesitate. He signaled to another guard, and together they began to usher my father toward the glass revolving doors. Arthur was no longer a powerful patriarch. He was a nuisance being escorted out like a drunk at a wedding. As he hit the cold Chicago air, he turned back, his face contorted in the mask of pure, unadulterated rage. He pointed a finger at the building, screaming a final threat that echoed through my earbuds. "You'll never escape me, Sarah. I'll pull every string. I'll take back every cent. You'll be on the street, begging me for a room by the time I'm done with you." The doors clicked shut, and the feed returned to the quiet, empty lobby. I sat back in my chair, my hand steady as I saved the recording to my market volatility folder. He thought he was winning the war of intimidation, but all he had done was provide me with the perfect climax for my legal petition. The showdown had begun, and Arthur had just handed me the rope. I did not wait for the security team at my office to ask if I was all right after watching that digital execution in the lobby. I simply closed my laptop with a soft, final click, tucked the black leather binder into my professional bag, and walked toward the elevators with a steady, clinical pace. The -2 degrees Chicago wind was still howling outside, rattling the glass of the skyscrapers like a hungry ghost. But as I stepped onto the salt-crusted sidewalk of downtown, I felt an internal heat that had nothing to do with the weather. I was 26 years old, a marketing specialist who made $50,000 a year, and I was currently walking toward the Daily Center, the heart of the Cook County legal machine. My father, Arthur, truly believed that his $40,000 investment in my tuition had purchased a lifetime of my silence and submission. He thought he was the architect of my life, but he had failed to realize that I had spent my entire career learning how to manage liabilities and protect a brand's reputation. I wasn't just a daughter seeking a handout. I was a citizen seeking the secret weapon of the Safe Homes Act, a shield designed for people whose sanctuary had been turned into a surveillance state by those who claimed to love them. Inside the courthouse, the air smelled of old paper, wet wool, and industrial floor cleaner, a scent of clinical justice that I found deeply satisfying. It was ASMR for the brain, a place where facts mattered more than the size of one's ego or the price of one's cashmere coat. I stood in the long line for the clerk of the court, my professional demeanor acting as a cloak of invisibility among the sea of people. To the bailiffs and busy attorneys, I was just another young woman in a modest coat. But inside my bag, I carried the receipts, the high-definition proof that my father was not a protector, but a predator who weaponized his wealth. I thought about my brother Brandon, probably driving the silver SUV our father bought him while I stood here in the silence of the abyss, and I felt a chilling sense of intellectual satisfaction. I wasn't here to scream or cry about the betrayal of the fake key or the midnight raids. I was here to file a petition for a temporary restraining order based on documented stalking, unauthorized entry, and financial domestic abuse. When it was finally my turn to present my case, I didn't hesitate. I laid out the black leather binder with the precision of a marketing executive pitching $1 million campaign. I showed the court the time-stamped video from my hidden kitchen camera, clear 1080p footage of my mother, Margaret, sneaking into my home like a common thief using the original key she had lied about returning. I presented the logs of Arthur's threatening texts, where he explicitly stated that my $40,000 education gave him the right to manage my direct deposit and audit my very thoughts. Finally, I played the audio I had recorded only an hour ago, the sound of my father screaming in my building lobby that I was a rounding error and that he would see me on the streets. I spoke in the diction of expertise, explaining how his actions met every criteria for harassment under Illinois law. I wasn't doing this because I hated him. I was doing it because I had a right to exist without being a line item in his ledger. The judge, a woman with graying hair and eyes that looked like they had seen 1,000 Arthurs, didn't need a long deliberation. She saw the slow reveal of the evidence, the cold, hard facts that stripped away the mask of a concerned patriarch to reveal a man who viewed his daughter as a piece of property. She listened as I described the psychological toll of realizing my home was no longer a refuge, but a glass box under my father's magnifying glass. With a sharp, final scratch of her pen, she signed the order. It was done. I held the temporary restraining order in my hand, the paper feeling heavier and more valuable than any investment my father had ever touted. He was now legally barred from coming within 500 feet of me, my workplace, or my residence, and the Safe Homes Act would allow me to break my lease and disappear without a single financial penalty. I walked out of the courtroom and into the fading Chicago light, the silence of the abyss finally replaced by the quiet, steady hum of true freedom. I felt a strange sense of empathy for the girl I used to be, the one who worked double shifts at a diner while Arthur bought Brandon's loyalty. That girl was gone. In her place was a woman who understood that the American dream wasn't about the money your father gave you, but the independence you were willing to fight for. Arthur thought he had bought my soul for $40,000, but he was about to find out that my liberty was a liability he could never afford to settle. The trap was no longer just a plan. It was a legal reality, and the next time my father tried to turn his key in my lock, he wouldn't find a submissive daughter. He would find a process server waiting to deliver his total liquidation. Arthur and Margaret drove back to their manicured suburban estate in a silence that felt heavy with a dark, misplaced triumph. The heater in their luxury sedan hummed against the -2-degree Chicago air, and I could imagine my father's hands steady on the leather steering wheel, his mind already tallying the dividends of his morning assault at my lobby. He likely turned to my mother, his voice dripping with that patronizing, abrupt tone, remarking that by the time the next rent check was due, I would be on my knees begging for a room in their basement. They believed they had successfully weaponized my $40,000 education to break my spirit, unaware that I had spent the afternoon at the Cook County Courthouse turning their arrogance into a catastrophic legal liability. As they pulled into their cobblestone driveway, the high-arched security lights flickered on, illuminating a man standing by their front door. Not a guest, and certainly not a beggar. Arthur stepped out of the car, his charcoal coat flapping in the wind, his face already twisting into a mask of annoyance at the intruder on his private property. The man didn't flinch. He simply stepped forward and asked for Arthur Miller by name. When my father confirmed his identity with a curt, superior nod, the man handed him a thick envelope. "You've been served, sir," he said, his voice as clinical and cold as the ice on the pavement. I wasn't there to see it, but I didn't need to be. The ASMR for the brain was the knowledge that my secret weapon, the temporary restraining order, was finally in his hands. My father tore the envelope open with trembling fingers, his arrogance shifting to a sharp, jagged confusion as he read the words Order of Protection and Safe Homes Act. The transition from arrogant to absolutely confused was instantaneous. His face, usually a mottled purple of controlled rage, turned a ghostly, chalky white as he reached the section detailing the 500 feet restriction. He was now legally barred from my apartment, my office, and my very presence, with the documentation of his own lobby outburst and my mother's midnight raids serving as the ironclad evidence that sealed his fate. Margaret peered over his shoulder, her hand flying to her mouth as she realized the original key she had used to violate my sanctuary was now a recorded exhibit in a criminal file. There was no need for me to scream or use violence. The law had spoken for me in short, sharp sentences. Sentences that stripped Arthur of the only thing he truly valued: control. The extreme glee I felt sitting in my office wasn't about revenge. It was about the cold, intellectual satisfaction of a strategist who had successfully liquidated a toxic asset. My father had spent 26 years treating me like a rounding error on his tax returns, but he had failed to account for the fact that a daughter who survives on $50,000 a year knows exactly how to make every move count. While he stood in the cold of his own driveway, realizing his $40,000 investment had just bought him a one-way ticket to a courtroom, I was already moving a new apartment. My new address was a secret, my locks were brand new, and the only chains left in my life were the ones he was currently wearing in the form of a legal mandate. The game was over, and for the first time in my life, the only person holding the keys was me. 6 months have drifted by since the day the process server stood in my father's driveway, and Chicago is once again wrapped in the white, biting embrace of winter. I sit by the window of my new apartment, a space Arthur will never find, holding a steaming cup of Earl Grey tea that warms my palms. Outside, the wind howls at -2 degrees, but the drafty windows of my old life are gone, replaced by a silence that is no longer an abyss, but a sanctuary. The legal battle was quiet, clinical, and absolute. When faced with high-definition evidence of stalking and financial coercion, Arthur's high-priced lawyers advised him to settle and stay away. I didn't ask for a settlement or a refund of that infamous $40,000 tuition. I simply asked for my name to be scrubbed from his ledgers and my life to be removed from his jurisdiction. I have learned that the American dream isn't about the wealth you inherit, but the sovereignty you are willing to defend. I rarely think of my father now, but when I do, I am surprised to find that I no longer feel the searing heat of rage. Instead, I feel a quiet, distant pity. Arthur is a man who spent his entire life trying to buy loyalty, only to find himself sitting in a mahogany-filled mansion with no one left to listen to his commands. He saw my $50,000 salary as a rounding error, but he failed to realize that his own life was a series of diminishing returns. He traded his daughter for a sense of control that slipped through his fingers like Chicago snow. My mother, Margaret, still sends the occasional hollow text, but her words no longer carry the weight of a threat. They are just echoes from a house built on sand. I have forgiven her, not because she asked for it, but because I refuse to carry their baggage into my future. I am no longer an investment to be managed or a liability to be liquidated. My new home is modest, but every inch of it belongs to me. There are no fake keys hidden in drawers, no hair on the pillows that isn't my own, and no feeling of being watched by an invisible predator. I have found a profound healing in the simple acts of everyday life. Choosing my own furniture, managing my own bank account, and locking my door knowing that the only person with the power to open it is me. The ASMR for the brain that I once found in legal statutes has been replaced by the rhythmic ticking of a clock in a peaceful room. I know the road ahead will still have its challenges, and $50,000 a year in this city still requires a sharp eye on a budget. But for the first time in 26 years, I am the architect of my own destiny. As the snow blurs the lights of the city outside, I realize that the secret weapon wasn't the law or the cameras, but the courage to stop being who they wanted me to be. I didn't seek revenge, and I didn't set out to destroy a family. I simply demanded the right to exist as a person, not a property. I put down my tea and look at the single, solid brass key resting on my coaster. It isn't a silver decoy or a weaponized debt. It is just a piece of metal that marks the boundary of my freedom. I am whole. I am safe. And I am finally, truly home. I didn't take revenge. I just reclaimed the right to live as myself. What a powerful journey Sarah has been on. It's never easy to stand up to the people who raised us, especially when they use our gratitude as a weapon. But Sarah showed us that being a good daughter doesn't mean being a doormat. The American dream isn't just about owning a home or a car. It's about owning your freedom. To all the women listening today, your hard work is your strength, and you have every right to set boundaries that protect your peace and your future. How did Sarah's story make you feel? Have you ever had to choose between family expectations and your own sanity? Please share your wisdom and experiences in the comments below. Your story might be the healing someone else needs today. Don't forget to subscribe for more stories of resilience. Until next time, take care of yourselves.